Do ask Mr. Cowup to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Cowup, ready to carry on?
Indeed, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Cowup. Now, before the break, we were about to examine the start of the first regional round of consultation. Excuse me, so that's the process I'd like to discuss with you now. Excuse me. Now, you explain at paragraph 79 of your third witness statement, and if we go to LFB 00119849/36. And if we look at the third sentence, you say there that the first round of regional consultation involved the circulation of the draft GRA by Derek Clough to all GRA committee members for them to consult with their respective CFOA regions. And then if you go on further to paragraph 82 at page 37, you say that although the draft GRA 3.2 was ready for circulation by December 2011, Derek Clough delayed its circulation until March 2012. Can you help us? Why was that delay affected by Mr. Clough?
I can't remember with 100 complete certainty, but I think if you referred earlier to the GRA programme, and I think there'd been delays with some of the other documents, and it was a question of measuring into the process so that there wasn't too many documents out for consultation at one time.
So it's for pacing purposes?
For internal programme pacing purposes, that's a really good way to summarise it.
And so the practical consequence was, before it got going in a substantive way, the GRA process was already behind schedule?
Yes.
Now, we can see an email that Derek Clough sent to the GRA committee on the 11th of March 2012, requesting responses by the 30th of March 2012. That email can be found at LFB 00102355. And if we can look at the second paragraph of that email, Derek Clough refers there to the, quote, risk matrix for the high-rise GRA, close quotes. The risk matrix was a separate document, is that correct?
No, it was an additional section to the main text. So if you look at GRA 3.2 version 2, all you'll see is the main text description of the hazards and the control measures. There was a decision taken somewhere along the line to then provide the same information in a matrix format, and the objective for that was to assist local fire services in carrying out their local risk assessment. So we were doing a lot of the work for them by identifying the hazards and setting out the control measures in a matrix format.
And to that end, you set out in table form all the risks identified in GRA 3.2 and the relevant control measures.
Correct.
And the risk assessment document, as you say, was eventually all incorporated into the body of GRA 3.2 and ultimately became section 2 of GRA 3.2.
That's correct.
Yeah. And if we can look, simply for illustrative purposes, at the final version of GRA 3.2 as published in February 2014, which is at LFB 001255. And then if we can look at page 37 onwards, we see set out there a table identifying the list of activities, associated hazards and risks, identifying persons at risk and the relevant control measures. That's what the risk matrix transmogrified into, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And is it correct that the content of this table is very much lifted from the content of the GRA document itself, i.e. there's nothing in here which isn't in GRA?
I'd like to think so. We certainly checked it a few times, but that's exactly what should be the case.
Now, the consultation responses that you received were collated into a spreadsheet, which was considered in due course by you and Philip Morton. Is that right?
I think it's right for this round. It's definitely right for the national round. I'm not 100% certain whether we put all of the regional consultation responses into a spreadsheet. We certainly considered them as they were on the individual documents, but I'm not so sure that we put them into a spreadsheet.
Now, it's right to say that you amended the draft on the basis of the feedback and then sent an updated draft to Derek Clough on the 9th of May 2012 as the precursor to the second round of consultation at the national level. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, if we can go to your third witness statement again, which is LFB 00119849/38, and paragraph 102. I don't think. Maybe that's not quite right. Well, let's leave that for the moment. Oh, yes, I think it has set out the correct bit there. So you set out who's consulted and all the rest of it. Now, if we can go on to the second round of consultation, which, if I can ask us to look at page 46 in this statement. And if we look at paragraph 104 and the first two sentences, there you say that the national consultation was itself delayed until July 2012, and that you understood that the reason for this was that Derek Clough wanted to await the publication of the Shirley Towers inquest report. Is that right?
Yes.
Were you content with that delay?
It made sense. We'd spoken to Hampshire Fire Rescue as part of our research and preparation for this work, but it would always make sense to make sure that you've covered off what is in the formal inquest findings, and therefore, yeah, it was a sensible decision.
Now, the GRA 3.2 was eventually circulated on the 29th of July 2012. You deal with this at paragraph 105 below on the screen. You then go on to explain at paragraph 106, from the bottom of page 46 onwards, that the national consultees included the chief fire officers of fire and rescue authorities throughout England, as well as the CFOs for Scotland, North Wales, South Wales and Northern Ireland. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the replies from the national consultees were then collated into a table. And if we look at paragraph 108, you confirm that there.
Yes.
Now, if we turn to the table that's referred to in paragraph 108, that can be found at LFB 00102443. Again, apologies, that's something that will need to be downloaded. And if we could look at line 155, I think the identification of the line is at the bottom of the box. We see here a response received from Gary Brandwick from North Wales. And I'd particularly like you to look at the text at 159, which relates to the section of 3.2 that was entitled Evacuation of Buildings. And we can see the GRA text that Mr. Brandwick is commenting upon. So it's set out immediately before his comment in column E. And under the heading in capitals of evacuation of buildings, it says this: firefighting operations can be affected by the type of evacuation being undertaken, the progress of the evacuation, and the number and type of people being evacuated. Incident commanders must consider both the effect of firefighting tactics on the evacuation of occupants and, conversely, the effect of evacuation on tactics. If, for example, a building's evacuation plan includes the use of lifts by occupants, there may be an impact on the availability of fire lifts for use by fire and rescue service personnel. The need to assist with the evacuation of persons can divert crews away from the tasks they were briefed to undertake. This can have an adverse effect on the incident commander's plan and resourcing for the incident. Now, Mr. Brandwick's comment appears immediately underneath that quote in bold, and he said this: "This is a very topical discussion point at the moment, and this paragraph in a national GRA document does not do the necessity for getting the evacuation strategy correct justice. having researched this dilemma in some depth with our legislative fire safety department, the conclusion we have come to at the present time is that the OIC, so Officer in Command, in charge of the first attendance, is in the best position to dictate the evacuation tactics. But this does not help control room staff, who may be receiving multiple calls and are unsure of the advice to give. If a building was fitted throughout with a sprinkler system, then a stay-put policy would generally be warranted. But without such a system, how can we be sure that any built-in or engineered solutions have not been compromised? And how often would we need to inspect these buildings to be confident the prescribed evacuation policy was still valid? And we see in column F that Mr. Brandwick's views were rejected. Do you remember considering Mr. Brandwick's feedback as part of the consultation process?
I do.
What was your assessment of the merits and disadvantages of what Mr. Brandwick was suggesting?
First thing I would say is that he's put that comment against page 7 of the document, which is merely a statement of hazards, not a statement of control measures and actions that might be taken at the scene. So that's the first point, and that's more of a drafting issue, if you like.
And that's the point that's made in column G, I think. Is that right?
Yes. However, I can see where you're going with this in terms of the substantive point. The document does, of course, say that the incident commander should change the evacuation strategy if their perception of the fire or the incident requires that. And in terms of fire survival guidance, it also says that the incident commander should liaise with brigade control and make sure that the two sets of advice are in accordance with each other, so that if it is changed at the incident, then control would be informed and they would need to give different advice to callers.
Looking at what Mr. Brandwick says here, certainly on one reading, he's concerned that an evacuation strategy, including stay put, depended essentially on buildings' fire-engineered solutions operating as intended in circumstances where those fire-engineered solutions did not always operate as intended and could not necessarily be relied upon to do so. First of all, was that how you read his comment when you initially considered it back in 2012?
It was, and on reflection, I think we should have given him more of a detailed response. I think the point he's making in his second paragraph is very much a regulatory fire safety issue as to whether stay put is acceptable in a building, whether it's got sprinklers or some other form of fire safety engineering. That's not an issue that the GRA was able to address, because the GRA is about providing operational guidance to operational crews. That I saw that at the time, and I still do see it as a regulatory fire safety issue. I completely accept that in our comments we would have been better to ask Gary Brandwick to take that up through his fire safety department with CLG, the part of CLG that deals with fire safety policy.
Cutting through that, Mr. Cowup, looking at the first paragraph there, what he's basically saying is you can't safely assume that a building will perform as intended. Now, that's a sound, legitimate point of view, isn't it? Did you agree with him?
I do agree, yes.
Yeah. And I think you also agree with me that the observations he puts in his first paragraph deserved a greater, more reasoned response than a simple rejection, didn't they?
I would accept that, and I would accept that in our response we could have been clearer than we were.
And it's also, apologies for cutting across you, Mr. Cowup, but what the problem he identifies here, i.e. you can't assume that a building will perform as intended, was a risk that was realised at Lacknall, wasn't it?
Yes.
And one of the purposes of GRA 3.2 was to deal with the lessons learned from LACNOR, and yet the rejection does not appear to engage with a learning point that did arise from LACNOR, as phrased here by Mr. Brandwick.
I do take a slightly different view on that.
What is that view?
So my view is that GRA 3.2 version 3 did address the issues identified from LACNOR. I'm quite confident about that. With regard to this particular point, which I think is more about liaison between the incident commander at the scene and brigade control, I accept that we perhaps should have made it even clearer than we did, that there needs to be very close and ongoing liaison, because I think that's the main point that he's making. I accept he's making a point about failing buildings, but I think the nub of what he's saying there is that there needs to be close liaison between the incident commander and brigade control, and I fully accept that.
The other item of feedback that I'd like to discuss with you today is that received during the national consultation, and it really dealt with the discrete issue of the function of GRA 3.2. Now, it's not recorded on this spreadsheet, but you do, in fairness, refer to it in the PC6 report. And could we go to that, which is at LFB 000 327 83/9. And if we look at paragraph 2.4.10, you say this: one of the common and most prominent themes that emerged from the consultation was that the section of GRA that described control measures had become too procedural, in quotes. It was certainly true that version 3 presented the actions necessary for safe and effective fire service operations in a logical order, but in this respect, the changes that were made were only expanding on the approach that had already been taken in version 2 of GRA at 3.2. Now, when you refer to the section of GRA that described control measures, are you referring there to the risk matrix we've just been considering?
No, the main text.
Main text.
Well, both. I mean, the control measures are described in both, but they're described in the sense that's procedural. They're described in section 1.
And what was your understanding of the criticism that the section was, quotes, too procedural, close quotes?
The criticism was made by a number of people. The Deputy Chief Fire Officer in Hertfordshire was probably the person leading this particular criticism, and he felt it was too close to a service policy, and he felt it should have less detail and less information. Myself and many others on the committee took a different view, and as I said earlier, for me this was about helping local fire services to create an effective policy. So the idea of putting the information in a chronological order would greatly assist most fire services that would adopt that approach for their procedure. If you read version 2, the information jumps around from topic to topic and from different points in the incident to different points. So it goes from the beginning of the incident to the middle, then back to the beginning, and then covers things that might happen later on. So from my perspective, it was better to present the information chronologically, and also because we'd gathered a lot of information and some of it was quite complex, that meant our take on that procedure was really quite involved, and some people felt it was too involved for a generic risk assessment.
Now, can we now turn to the final version of GRA 3.2, which was produced on the 8th of November 2012, following the close of the national consultation on the 14th of September of that year. Now, if we can go back to your third witness statement, LFB 001118494/51.
Apologies, I don't think it's fair to describe that as the final version.
Well, the final was in inverted commas. Well, please don't worry, Mr. Cowup. We'll come on to matters. dealing things, first of all, with the period of consultation, you'll see dealt with at paragraph 115. You confirm the consultation period formally closed on the 14th of September 2012, and between October and December 2012, you reviewed the responses to the national consultation, but that no further drafts were produced during that time. Again, does that remain a fair summary?
Yes.
You also explain, if we go over the page, there we go, paragraph 116, that it was decided to postpone the production of further drafts of the GRA pending both the Shirley Towers and the Lacknell House findings. Is that right?
Yes.
And the Lacknell House inquest hearing started in January 2013.
I believe so, yes.
So by this time, so September 2012, when the national consultation closed, is it right that the LFB had completed its own internal investigation into the Lacknell House fire and was preparing for the inquests?
Yes.
By that stage, the LFB would have had, presumably, a clear appreciation of the learning points arising out of that fire.
I believe so.
Did you think, therefore, it was necessary to await the outcome of the inquest before making further progress with the draft GRA?
As I explained earlier, I think it's always prudent to wait for the formal findings of a formal inquiry. We anticipated what we thought were going to be the recommendations and the issues, but I think it's prudent to wait for that to be confirmed in writing.
Now, if we can just clarify one matter, if we go to paragraph 120 of this statement, which is at page 53, you say there that you circulated on the 8th of November what you considered to be at the time to be the final draft. That's what I was referring to earlier on, ready for publication. And you sent it to Derek Clough and Paul, is it Wolstenholmes of the FBU?
Correct.
Now, we can have a look at that email, which is at LFB 000090716. And we find your email is the is the second email in that thread. It's sent at 16:08. And you say this: please find attached final versions of the high-rise GRA, which is now ready for publication from LFB's perspective. We have provided 2 copies, the first version of which shows in track changes the amendments which have been made as a result of feedback received from the second, open brackets, CFO, close brackets, round of consultation, and the second of which is a clean version, which is easier to read. As already advised, the consultation process generated a high volume of feedback and a wide variety of views, hence the time necessary to consider all of these carefully in order to produce the final draft. Although some people will possibly still disagree with the content, I am satisfied that we have struck a reasonable balance of all the views we have received, and, more importantly, that the document encompasses all the key risks, issues, and associated control measures that have been identified as a result of incidents such as Shirley Towers and Lacknell. Now, that email tends to suggest that you were confident that the draft GRA at that stage properly reflected the relevant learning from Lacknell. Is that a fair observation?
Yes.
Now, we can see from the first email in this thread, just going up.
Well, subject to the formal inquest findings being a variation to what we understood at that time.
Now, you forwarded this email to, I think, fair to say, your line managers, so AC Knighton and Gary Dobson.
Gary Reason.
Gary Reason, sorry.
Yes.
And you say in the middle of that email this: the production of this document has been a very significant piece of work, but I am very pleased with the outcome, and I'm satisfied it will lead to safer high-rise operations both in LFB and the UK Fire Service. Provided no more changes are made as a result of any further response from the FBU, we will shortly start work on revising LFB's operational procedure to bring it line with the GRA. Now, there is no mention there of a possible or potential contribution or review from the DCLG. Is that right?
No, there isn't.
So is it fair to say that you weren't expecting any further substantive comment from them before publication?
Not at that stage, because my understanding, as I explained earlier, was that Derek Clough, as their representative, was reviewing the document, presumably sharing it with colleagues as appropriate, and therefore I felt I knew he was happy with it at that time.
And so, absent any shouting from him?
Absence of any feedback from him or anyone else, I felt we were in a reasonable place, yes.
Can we look at the draft that you attached to this email, which can be found at LFB 000 33 886? And if we could turn to page 25. Now, here we have the section Evacuation and Fire Survival Guidance Calls, a section which we looked at in its earlier life. Now, 2 changes have been made to this section since the end of the consultation period. The first change is the insertion of the word numerous in the first line. The second change is the additional sentence at the end of the second paragraph, which reads, the type of evacuation being undertaken, the progress of the evacuation, and the number and type of people being evacuated can adversely affect firefighting operations. Now, can you help us? First of all, what was the thinking behind the first change, so the inclusion of the word numerous in the first sentence?
I think that would have, I can't precisely remember my thinking, but I think it would have reflected the fact that fire survival calls are fairly rare, but when we get them, they tend to be multiple. So I think I would have just been emphasising, particularly to fire services who may not have experienced that kind of incident, that they should expect the challenge of dealing with multiple calls.
Looking at the first paragraph, bearing in mind your experiences that you recount, I think you recount an incident where there were 36, you obviously have the benefit of LACNOR. Looking at how that first paragraph is drafted, would you accept that it doesn't fully convey the rarity of multiple FSG calls and the consequential difficulties and challenges that poses to control?
I would accept that.
Was that something, hindsight's a wonderful thing,
Indeed.
at the time, did it cross your mind that do we need to be conveying the rarity and in more detail the problems that flow from multiple FSGs?
I think as a partial counter to that, if we'd have expressed the rarity of it, is there not a risk that we would have downgraded its importance in people's minds? And we were quite strong at wanting people, as I said earlier, we were the only service, to my knowledge, that had a procedure on the ground for managing these, and I was very keen through the National Working Group to share that information, and indeed we shared LFB's policy as it was at the time with numerous brigades, because none of them had anything equivalent. So I think what we wanted to highlight to them, because if you get one call, there may well be serious challenges, but it's probably not too difficult to manage. But the fact is they do tend to happen in a multiple context. And then the risk of confusion, the risk, because the way in which the information is passed from a control room to the incident ground, and then of course information fed back, if you're doing that with multiple calls, I would never underestimate the challenge of doing that accurately and doing it well. So I think we wanted to emphasise that you've got to be ready for multiple calls, you've got to be ready for numerous multiple calls that are happening at the same time, and you would possibly need to prioritise the action.
And that was your thought process at the time?
It was.
And so does it flow from that? Was there a discussion between you and Mr. Morton or anyone else on your team about how to draft this particular sentence to convey how you dealt with the rarity And secondly, the seriousness and the significance of the consequential issues that flow from multiple FSG calls.
Beyond what I've just said, I mean, I don't think we spent a lot of time thinking about the rarity aspect of it. Perhaps we should have done, but I think what we were trying to do was share our knowledge and experience of what wasn't just Lacanau, but was several other incidents as well, with brigades that I knew from having spoken to them, it was even rarer in their services. So it was, how do we help them to benefit from what we've experienced?
And so the team coalesced around this drafting fairly speedily, from what you say.
Absolutely. I don't remember a particularly long or detailed discussion around it.
Can we look at the second change, which is the addition of the sentence at the end of the second paragraph? Again, what did you have in mind when you used the phrase, the type of evacuation? You may well have covered this in earlier evidence. I just want to ask you directly, looking at this.
Well, as we've already established this morning, obviously there are different strategies for different buildings. So some buildings carry out a phased evacuation. That can be just the fire floor or the fire floor and the floor above. Some buildings go straight for a full evacuation. Some do a zonal evacuation. There are many different variations. So understanding what kind of evacuation you're dealing with, if one is in progress when you arrive, is obviously very important.
Thank you. There is one express reference to stay put advice in the draft that had been added since the conclusion of the consultation. Can we go to page 15? Now, just to give you some context, Mr. Cowup, and we can go back to it if you need to, this is the part of the document that deals with key control measures, a section which started on page 11. And it forms part of the guidance on planning that fire and rescue services are advised to carry out in relation to high-rise buildings. Now, if we can look at the fourth paragraph from the bottom of this page, this is the one that contains the reference to stay put and the management of FSG calls. And what it says is this: FRSs should also have effective arrangements in place to handle fire survival calls from the public where they believe they are unable to leave their premises due to age, disability, mobility, illness, or the effects of fire. FRSs should consider both generic techniques for persons told to stay put, as well as bespoke arrangements for specific buildings where this is appropriate. These arrangements should include how calls will be passed and recorded at the instant, their impact on resources and mobilising, and how information will be exchanged between callers, control and managers at the instant, and vice versa. Now, the first question is this: did you consult with anyone at LFB Control about the content of this section?
By this point, this document had been consulted on internally through heads of service.
And Control would have been part of that process, would
Correct.
it? Yeah. And can you remember now whether you received any responses or feedback from Control on this particular passage?
I can't, but as I said earlier, what I can remember is that we worked closely with Control in establishing the FSG guidance generally, and in my mind, we were only reflecting that back here. So I wouldn't have envisaged Control would have an issue with what we've written here.
This would be reflecting your discussions?
Yes, and previous consultation with them on that specific policy.
Thank you. What did you mean by generic techniques for persons told to stay put?
I don't think they're my words. I think these were brought into this document at this stage as a result of a comment, so I can't actually explain that for you, unpack it.
You don't remember having to apply your mind to understanding what it meant?
Well, I think what they mean, I think they mean techniques for people generally, and then as it goes on to say, if you've got a high risk building such as the ones we mentioned this morning, you may have a bespoke contingency plan for that building. And that may include, for example, the provision of refuges or the other provisions that may be relevant to how you manage fire survival guidance.
Now, looking at this passage, what it doesn't address is the issue of how and in what circumstances to change stay put advice.
No.
Would you accept that?
I would, but I wouldn't expect that to be covered in the planning section because we are talking about pre-incident.
And equally in this section, there's no guidance on how and in what circumstances to tell residents to attempt to leave their property in a building where normally stay put advice applies.
No, but the same rationale applies. This is the planning phase, so we're not at the incident yet.
And you don't think that's a circumstance that ought properly to be considered in the context of planning?
Sorry, could you repeat?
The prospect of evacuation and how and in what circumstances stay put should be withdrawn in particular, you don't consider that an appropriate factor to be considered in the context of planning?
I think it is an appropriate factor, but I think elsewhere in this section we do refer fire services to the need to consider the evacuation strategy as part of their planning. So it's not in this particular paragraph, but I believe it is in the section.
Now, the second item of text that I'd like to ask you about is on page 14 of this draft, so the page before the present one. And we can see there in the bottom half of the page, there's express reference there to the need for contingency plans. And again, that's part of the planning section. Now, what the middle paragraph says is this: contingency plans should include a range of events which are foreseeable for the particular premises, including fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the potential for multiple rescues. Now, that same passage was found in the 2008 version of GRA 3.2. Mm-hmm. We've already seen it was a passage that was identified in November 2009 by Kevin Hughes, his gap analysis, in which he observed that the GRA was more detailed than the LFB's policy on contingency plans, and that LFB policy should be or could be enhanced with the inclusion of further information on and development of operational contingency plans. Now, when you transferred the guidance on contingency plans for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin and the consequential potential for multiple rescues from the 2008 version to this one, did it cause you to think about whether the LFB's own internal policies and procedures equipped personnel to prepare contingency plans for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin?
At the time I would have undertaken that work, the work to progress LFB's policy was obviously in the future. So it would certainly have been in my mind that this was going to be an issue. In fact, the whole GRA was going to be something we needed to transpose into LFB policy. Was I specifically thinking about this at the time that you refer to? I think the answer is probably no.
Thank you. Was specific guidance on how to develop an operational contingency plan rather than general guidance, was that a matter for local policy rather than the GRA in your view?
Yes, because the systems and processes do vary significantly from service to service.
Bearing in mind that, did you take any steps at this time to ensure that any deficiency in LFB's policy 633 was addressed, or at least on someone's radar to be addressed?
No, because at this point I still hoped that the GRA would be published within a reasonably quick time, and therefore I think my view was, let's wait for the final version of GRA 3.2, revise 633 on the basis of it, and publish it. The danger of doing it more piecemeal would be issuing multiple versions of the same document and getting people on fire stations to read multiple versions. My experience of working with people on fire stations is that wouldn't engender confidence or support, quite apart from the fact their capacity to keep reading iterations of the same thing. So I think it was wise, and I still think it would be wise, to wait until you've got all your ducks in a row, so to speak, and you're clear about all your changes and make them all at once.
Thank you. Finally, I'd like to look at the express reference to cladding that's in the draft. And that was dealt with in the 2008 version of GRA 3.2, which for context, let us look at briefly. And if we can go to HOM quadruple 02128/11. Now, we can see that the first paragraph here refers to arrangements for 72D visits and lists the information that should be gathered as part of that process. Now, that included, if we turn over to page 12, and the fourth bullet point, fourth bullet point from the top, I should say, building construction features which may promote abnormal or rapid fire spread, such as sandwich panels, cladding systems, voids, etc. Now, in your post-consultation version of 3.2, the reference to cladding remains, but in an altered form. Mm-hmm. And if we could look at that draft, LFB 0003386/13. And if we look at the pre-planning section, and we can see the bottom paragraph immediately before the bullet points reads, information to be gathered in relation to high-rise incidents should include. And again, we go over the page to page 14, and we look at the fifth bullet point from the top, and it says this: building construction features such as the presence and location of maisonette-style construction, sandwich panels, timber framing, cladding systems, surface-mounted trunking, ducting and voids, in addition to features which present a specific hazard, such as asbestos. Now, what appears to have been removed is the reference to construction features which promote abnormal or rapid fire spread. First of all, do you accept that?
I do accept that.
Can you help us? What was the rationale for the removal of those words?
I actually don't think there was a rationale. I think it was an omission.
Now, you have stated in your PC6 report, which we can find at LFB 000-327-83/22. And if we look at paragraph 3.7.5 at the bottom of the page, it says this: it is also pertinent to note that whilst various building construction features had been highlighted as playing a significant part in the development of recent major high-rise fires in the United Kingdom, the GRA authors were not aware of any evidence at the time of the GRA review process that cladding as a material and building system posed a significant fire hazard. Now, bearing in mind what you say there, would you accept that the 2008 version of GRA 3.2 referred explicitly to cladding systems as potentially promoting abnormal or rapid fire spread?
My understanding of the 2008 version, and I think it's, firstly, I'd like to say I understand cladding is a very sensitive issue, particularly to the families, and I recognise that. But what I'm about to say is a true representation of my understanding at the time. So the way that I understood cladding was not as a hazardous material in its own right, because I believed that it would have, as an external item of construction, it would have been non-combustible, because that was my understanding of the regulations. My understanding of the risk that cladding posed was that it had the potential to create a void, and that it was the void rather than the cladding which created the risk of fire spread. So I completely accept your point that in moving from version 2 to version 3, we lost that connection, and I regret that. However, what I'm really clear about, and I think this is the most important point, is that at no point did anyone indicate that cladding as a material in and of itself was a hazardous material? And when you consider the extent of consultation across the British Fire Service through CLG, if it had been understood, I would have expected someone to point it out.
Could I put a point directly to you? Could we go back to the 2008 version of 3.2, which is HOM quadruple 2128/12. And if we look at the bullet point from the fourth bullet point from the top, it says building construction features which may promote abnormal or rapid fire spread, such as cladding systems. None of the qualifications which you've set out there are set out here, are they?
I accept that. What I've given you is my understanding of why cladding was there in version 2 and an explanation, as far as I'm able to offer it, for how it was then treated in version 3. And I think the main point that I would want to emphasise again is that that was on the basis of not understanding it as a hazard, other than the fact that when it was put on a building, it had the potential to create a void, which had the potential to create abnormal and rapid fire spread.
Mr. Cowup, in answer to an earlier question, you said that the words promoting abnormal or rapid fire spread were dropped from the later version of 3.2 due to an omission. Now, are you saying that the omission was a conscious decision by you to drop those words, or is it simply in the realm of oversight?
Oversight.
So they were dropped by the authors of GRA 3.2 without any consideration in detail of the precise nature of the risks posed by cladding in relation to promoting rapid fire spread, for example. If it's an oversight, it's got to follow, hasn't it?
It has, and I can understand what you're saying. We did not understand the hazard of cladding. I think that is the fundamental point. I think to compound that, we dropped this connection with abnormal and rapid fire spread, so that is an oversight on my part.
Did anyone raise with you, as any member of your team, or anyone else for that matter, why those words promoting abnormal or rapid fire spread had been dropped from the later 3.2?
Not to my knowledge.
Can we now turn to Lacknell inquests and the further delay in the publication of 3.2 and the final internal responses from the LFB? Now, shortly after you sent what you consider to be the final version of 3.2 in November 2012, the Lacknell House inquest opened in January 2013. Now, you didn't give evidence at those inquests, I think I'm right in saying.
Correct.
Now, you emailed Gary Reason, Jim Knighton and others on the 5th of February 2013, in which you referred to the Lacknell inquests and the publication of the GRA. Now, can we look to that email, which is at LFB 000-93003? Can we look at the second email on that page, which you sent at 1803, and you say this: Dear all, for your interest and information, please see correspondence below between FBU National Health and Safety Official Paul Wolstenholmes, Lee Brinton, open brackets, Surrey FRS GRA Programme Manager, and myself regarding the high-rise GRA. Please note that due to the fact that the Lacknell inquest may affect the content of this GRA, I have agreed with Lee that it would be prudent to defer its publication until we know the inquest outcome and whether that will require any changes to this document. Obviously, if it becomes apparent that the outcome is going to be significantly delayed, that decision can be revisited. Now, had Lee Brinton succeeded Derek Clough as project manager of the GRA review programme by this stage?
No, and I apologise for the fact, I think that's an erroneous reference. Her role was always administrative, but in a more managerial sense. I think when Derek Clough retired, I think Surrey appointed another uniformed officer to take his place. However, I think it was very much a notional replacement because most of the GRAs by then were finished. This was one of the few that was still outstanding. And in practical terms, Lee Brinton was the person doing the work and the person we spoke to.
Thank you. Now, 4 days earlier, on the 1st of February 2013, you had recirculated the final draft GRA 3.2 to a number of individuals within the LFB for what you referred to as a sense check for consistency and to identify any formatting errors. Now, that particular email is at LFB 000 28835. Excuse me. Thank you. Again, can I apologise, Mr. Cowup, for reading it out, but it's probably the easier way of recording it on the transcript. Dear colleagues, I'm writing to seek your assistance in finalising the attached document, which is the new and extensively revised National High-Rise Generic Risk Assessment, GRA. This document has been authored by LFB on behalf of the CFRA as part of the review of the entire current GRA series and, as such, has taken almost 2 years to complete. The document has been subject to several rounds of very extensive and detailed national consultation, and despite the fact this subject is one about which many have strong and diverse opinions, I am pleased to say the content is now agreed. I'm sure you will recognise the importance of getting this document as right as possible, given the risk-critical nature of this incident type to both firefighters and the public alike. The version attached has now been typeset, ready for publication by the stationery office, and I have requested an opportunity to finally proofread the document before it goes for printing and to be placed on the CLG website. This is where you come in as people who I think have an eye for detail and/or sufficient interest in the topic to give this final draft version the close scrutiny I consider it deserves. You're also people who have not been previously involved in the formal consultation process, so I hope you can bring a useful degree of objectivity to this process on the basis of your reading of the text won't be influenced by any past involvement. In making this request, please note that I am asking you to sense check the document for consistency and in order to ensure the typesetting process has not introduced any formatting errors or otherwise corrupted the content. It will not generally be possible to amend the content at this stage unless there is a very good reason for doing so, so please confine your review of this document to a proofread. This is therefore not consultation. As a result of the fact we have decided to postpone publication until after the Lacknell inquest is complete, I'm sure you'll understand why. There is no immediate rush for your response, and I would ask you provide any comments, format changes, ideally using track changes, to Michelle Kunica on or before 4th of March 2013. In the unlikely event that you consider there is a very good reason to change the content, please highlight any such changes in yellow and also refer to them by page number in your response email. Now, can you explain if this group of individuals had, as you say in the fourth paragraph, sufficient interest in the topic, etc., why their substantive feedback had not already been sought as part of the various preceding consultation rounds?
Could we just scroll up so I can see exactly who they are?
Of course.
So they were from, reading across from the top, they were from Health and Safety, Operational Resilience, my own department, Spencer Alden Smith. He was out as a borough commander, I believe, at this time. Nick Coombe was Regulatory Fire Safety. Steve Dudney was someone who had a particular interest in high-rise. Dave Eaglin was somebody on a fire station that I thought might have a view. And Pat Tawney was someone who led on breathing apparatus policy. So these were people that knew a lot about policy but hadn't been involved. The consultation within LFB was via heads of service, so I wasn't cited on exactly which individuals they shared it with. It could be, to be fair, it could be that some of these people had seen it as a result of that, but these were people that I knew had an eye for detail, and I was, at this point, this document had been subject to so many changes, and that as the person that was very close to it, I wasn't entirely sure that I could see the wood for the trees. So I wanted someone who wasn't so close to it to just read it, you know, hopefully for the first time, but it wouldn't have mattered if they had been in the consultation. And as I said there, to give it that sense check that I think it needed to have, because it had been pulled so many different ways by so many of the different consultation responses that I was getting a little bit concerned about whether we'd lost the overall sense of what we were trying to say. So that was my rationale.
Were you also keen by this time, given how long the process had been going on for, that subject to there not being a significant delay concerning the Lacknell inquest, to get the guidance published?
Yes. I mean, after 2 years, I felt, and the consultation rounds and the responses and all the work we'd done with the Fire Brigade Union, you know, I thought the priority was to get this document out. We were some years after Lacknell and we needed to move on.
Was there any noise in the sector about the delay in the new GRA 3.2 that was relevant, or were people just awaiting publication in its own course?
I wasn't aware of anyone else in the fire sector expressing particular concerns, but certainly within LFB, I think we felt that it was time to get the document out.
Now, there was one substantive response to your email, and I think that came from Stephen Dudney, is that right?
That's correct.
And you helpfully reviewed this in your PC6 report, and if we go back to that, which is at LFB 000-327-83/11. And if we look at paragraphs 2.6.3 through to 2.6.5 at the top of the page, and you describe the response you received from Mr. Dudney thus. Although it was made clear that this was not a consultation regarding the document's content, one respondee did offer substantive feedback regarding changes that could be made with respect to building construction, which has the potential to be taken as relevant in the context of the Grenfell Tower fire. The comment related to large panel system LPS, which are prefabricated sections of concrete that had commonly been used in residential high-rise buildings that were constructed in the 1960s. LPS should not be confused with more modern cladding systems, and the hazard identified was that if it is poorly installed, LPS can create gaps and allow fire, smoke and heat to pass from one building compartment to another. As this comment had been received after the document content had already been agreed and its impact was already explained within GRA 3.2, the GRA author decided against making the requested change. Now, can we look at Stephen Dudney's response, which was set out in his email to you on the 6th of February 2013, which can be found at LFB 00102440, and it's the second email in the chain. You see the email's timed at 12:02 hours, and it's his first point that contains his comments about panel systems. And he says this: I've given this a slow and detailed look over and think I've highlighted any minor errors. This amounted to the removal of a double comma and a double full stop, as well as deleting a line about vandalism. I think it is a very comprehensive document which covers all of the issues that have been ongoing and unchallenged for many decades, as well as evolving to take account of the issues which modern firefighters are facing in high-rise fires, such as cable entanglement. Now, just stopping there, cable entanglement was a significant issue at Shelley Towers, is that right?
Absolutely.
And the email goes on to say this: however, in recognition of what you said, I appreciate changes are unlikely for a two glaring omissions that I feel I needed to get down on paper that I will leave for you to decide the weight of their significance. Number one, construction technique. One of the big issues related to construction that I've referenced previously is that of large panel system, LPS construction, often referred to as, quotes, system built, close quotes. This is where prefabricated sections of building are put together like a Lego set to enable the majority of construction to take place off-site and to facilitate quicker assembly on-site. There are still many system-built high-rises in London, and one assumes across the UK, as the contracts were widely awarded in the 1960s to well-known national building companies. The issues with these buildings are down to poor fits of the panels, which on a day-to-day basis may cause drafts within the building, but little else. And this is the bit I'd like to emphasise. Significantly, though, they have been known, to personal experience included, allow flames, smoke and heat to travel through parts of the compartments that may otherwise have been deemed fire-resistant. This includes unseen spread from one flat to another, horizontally or vertically, and smoke seepage into protected areas. Incidentally, the building I experienced this in was Ronan Point on Plaistows ground in the early 90s. This, of course, was the building that suffered extensive collapse in 1968 when a gas explosion caused catastrophic failure of the LPS construction. Now, taking a step back from this correspondence, your point here is that LPS panels are made of concrete, and so they can't be safely or reasonably compared to the properties and materials used in modern cladding panels. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Wasn't Stephen Dewdney highlighting another, mindful of that distinction, wasn't he highlighting another point, which is another means by which compartmentation in a high-rise fire may not be necessarily or safely relied upon to subsist?
I would accept that, and I think if this comment had came sooner, there would have been no good reason to not include it as another example. But what I would say is that in a more generic sense, GRA 3.2 was very clear about the fact that firefighters should expect compartmentation to sometimes fail, should expect that poor workmanship or deteriorating materials can result in the products of combustion spreading. So in the material sense of what that would have added to the document at that stage, and I was mindful that we were, as I understood it at that time, very close to publication, I didn't feel it was sufficient to include.
Did it prompt you, though, to look back at the draft to see whether it had given sufficient prominence and guidance on the issue of compartmentation failure and its consequences for operational firefighting?
No.
Was the reason why it didn't prompt that because by this stage the greater concern was to get the document published rather than rewrite or finesse the text?
I think when you're producing a document of this size and complexity, there's always a balance between bringing the thing to conclusion and publication and continually revising it. Did I get the balance right on this occasion? I'm not 100% sure, but I didn't feel that what Steve had said was of sufficient, it would make sufficient difference to what we'd already covered in the document, albeit more generally than he had. He gave a very clear and positive example. And as I say, if that comment had been received sooner, I'm fairly confident it would have found its way into the document as another exemplar of what people should look for. But in the circumstances, I didn't feel it was sufficiently of sufficient risk to warrant changing the document at that time.
But bearing in mind what you say, would you accept, though, that Mr. Dewdney's comment is an echo of the comment that was made by Mr. Brandwick from North Wales, namely that you ought not readily or safely to assume that compartmentation will subsist. And Mr. Brandwick's comment didn't make it into GRA 3.2 either.
At the time, I certainly didn't make any connection at all between the two comments.
Although they are.
Now you've drawn that comparison, I can see how, with hindsight, that might appear to be the case.
Your reply to Mr. Dewdney, you replied on the same day. And if we go to the top email in this thread, your email sent at 13:26, so an hour and a bit, 20 minutes after the trigger email. Steve, thanks for your feedback. The consultation has closed, and adding new content was not the objective at this time. But I understand the points you raised below. We're going to wait for the outcome of LACNOR before publishing this document. And if this requires changes, additions and/or amendment, we can consider these issues at that time. Who knows, they may even emerge as issues from that source. Now, when you referred to the outcome of LACNOR and stated the issues identified by Mr. Dewdney may even emerge as issues from that source, does that mean that you're anticipating that the issue of compartmentation failure was going to, quotes, emerge, close quotes, as an issue following the outcome of the inquest?
I was certainly aware that the failure of compartmentation was a key lesson identified from LACNOR, yes.
And you're aware of that from, when I say you, I mean the LFB.
Yes.
Were well aware of that very soon after the LACNOR fire itself back in July 2009.
Indeed.
The impression arising from this email is that you are not willing to address in more details the consequences of compartmentation failure unless they were addressed by the LACNOR coroner. Would you accept that point?
I wouldn't accept that point in the sense of my recollection of this response was I was not seeking to do that. I can see now with hindsight how you could interpret it in that way. So yes, I accept it based on the way you've conjoined things, but that certainly wasn't what was in my mind when I replied to Steve Dewdney.
Now, the following month, while the LACNOR inquests were continuing, you received another view on the final draft of GRA 3.2, and this time from Michael Curran.
Right.
And he emailed you and Philip Morton on the 18th of March 2013. And his email can be found at LFB 000 90754. First of all, before we go to the text, what was Michael Curran's role at the LFB?
He was an operational officer. I think he had previously been in my team. I think at this time, as it says on his sign-off, he was part of the health and safety team. I believe he was he was detached into the LACNOR review team.
Can you give us an idea, how senior was he in the hierarchy?
Well, as it says on his sign-off, he's a group manager, so senior management.
Now, as the email says, I've gone through the draft GRA up to page 31 and made a few observations for discussion. I'll send out a meeting wizard to enable a roundtable discussion, as you suggested. Now, can you help us? Why was he responding to the final draft at this stage, so mid-March? And he was not, we can go back to it, but he wasn't one of the recipients of your email of the 1st of February 2013.
Can we see the documents that precede this?
When you say documents that precede...
Well, the email. This is a chain, I presume? Or is this single email?
This is a single email.
In that case, I can't really answer. He may have had sight. I think I would have sent, as you say, the word final was used quite a few times in this context. I would have sent various final versions to Tim Cutbill, who he was working for. So quite possibly he obtained a copy through that route.
Now, the annotated draft that Mr. Curran provided attached to this email can be found at LFB 000 89264. Now, one of the suggestions he made in this document was in relation to the only express mention of stay put that we've looked at, and it's the one we looked at in the pre-planning section. And for this purpose, can we go to page 16 in this draft? And if that could be expanded slightly so the writing's clearer. Thank you. Now, the paragraph on arrangements for FSG calls, as we can see, is at the top of page 16. And Mr. Curran added track text to the end of the initial paragraph. And I'll read out the entire paragraph just so it's clear from the record. FRSs should also have effective arrangements in place to handle fire survival calls from the public where they believe they're unable to leave their premises due to age, disability, mobility, illness, or the effects of fire. FRSs may consider both generic techniques for persons told to stay put, as well as bespoke arrangements for specific buildings where this is appropriate. The new text says this: a re-evaluation process should be included to ensure the balance of risk to the occupier is considered as circumstances change. This re-evaluation process may influence a change in the advice previously given. And then it goes on to say these arrangements may include how calls will be passed and recorded at the instant, their impact on resources and mobilising, and how information will be exchanged between callers, control and managers at the instant. Now, wasn't that the first time there'd been a reference to changing stay put advice in the draft GRA?
I don't believe so, because I believe in the evacuation section we spoke from early drafts onwards about the need for the incident commander to change the strategy if the fire escalated. So I don't believe that.
Express reference to stay put. To put
I
a more precise question to you.
Yeah, I accept not expressly in relation to stay put, but as I've said all the way along, at this point, because the document was intended for all high-rise buildings and not just residential buildings, we had not specifically mentioned stay put in the context of evacuation. I fully accept, with hindsight and on reflection, that was a mistake, and I've accepted that.
Would you accept this is the first time that there'd been any express, emboldened, underlined, reference to needing to keep advice to callers under review?
I think that requirement is covered by what I've just said, but I accept that this phrases it more explicitly and better. All I would say at this point is one of the criticisms that we'd had of the GRA at this point, and I was probably very mindful of this, is that it was too long, too complicated, and too detailed. And that, whilst that doesn't excuse what I can now see in the context of the Grenfell Tower fire, was, looks really quite negative. At the time, I was very mindful that if we continued to change it and add detail, the people who'd been criticising me and others for many months, I'd be adding fuel to the fire, and also I was going to be changing it at a point when I'd already said it was the final draft. So on reflection, I think that would have added value without a doubt, but at the time I had a rationale for not accepting it.
Did you have a blanket rationale for not accepting further changes at this stage, simply to get the thing published?
I think the first thing I would say is that we weren't generally seeking further changes at this stage. So I can't remember the mechanism by which Michael Curran got involved, but it wasn't at my behest, I'm pretty sure. And yes, I think there was a priority. You mentioned yourself about the delay in the GRA starting the review process. I felt after 2 years we'd reached a point where we needed to publish.
So the answer is yes to my question.
Yeah, I'm trying to explain why, but yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you. Did you ever discuss the substance of these points with Mr. Curran?
I thought you might ask me that, and I'd be honest, I can't. I mean, I used to see Mike Curran quite a lot, so we may have discussed it informally. I can't remember having a formal meeting to discuss his feedback.
Now, apologies for this, but it's difficult remembering the cut and thrust of email communications and meeting requests and the rest of it. We've been provided with an electronic meeting request that you sent to Michael Curran and Philip Morton to review MC amendments, so it must be Mike Curran,
Yeah.
to high-rise GRA, plus consider any available outcome from Lacknell inquest on the 17th of April 2013, so roughly a month after his email. We can find that at LFB 000086653. Mr. Cowup, I more than appreciate that 8 years after the event, nearly 9 years, it's difficult to remember these things. Can you remember whether the meeting ever took place?
I can't.
But in any event, it didn't result in any amendment to the text.
No.
Now, if we can go back to Mr. Curran's suggested amendments, LFB 000-89264/25. 25. Thank you. Now, we've looked at this section.
Are we going to be looking at a series of these amendments?
We will be looking at a few more. I've probably got 10 more minutes on this, sir, but I don't think it would cause great interruption to the flow of matters if we had a break now.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to see if you think you can finish a topic in 10 minutes.
Well, that's a challenge.
We can go on, otherwise we can stop now.
I think we can, so I'll plough on, sir, and
Very well.
slightly thrown what I was going to ask then. Looking at the second set of changes that is set out there at the bottom of the page, we see emboldened in red, after the black text which says fire survival calls can be numerous during a high-rise incident, the IC will need to prioritise these by taking any action necessary to either rescue or reassure building occupants. Mr. Curran suggested including the following in red text: a clear record of fire survival calls and relevant information on their location and circumstances may be necessary at the mobilising centre and the incident ground. This may assist confirmation of priorities and subsequent reassessment of those priorities should information change as the incident develops. Now, had the need to keep a clear record of FSG calls on the incident ground as well as in the control room occurred to you before Mr. Curran's suggested amendment?
Absolutely. And for me, that was very well covered in fire survival guidance policy. So there's always a question of how much repetition we include within operational policy. And we, I accept this was the national guidance, but as I've already said, we'd shared London's FSG policy with other services. So I very much, what Mike has said there is obviously very true and very relevant, but where does it sit? Does that sit in a high-rise policy, or does that sit in a fire survival guidance call policy, which, although high-rise is the predominant source of those calls, they can in fact come from any incident. So my judgment was that that comment, whilst perfectly valid, would sit better in FSG policy rather than high-rise policy.
So it was rejected as a result of a considered decision as opposed to being rejected on the basis of your blanket ban on further changes at this stage?
I don't think I had a blanket ban.
Did you make any changes at this stage to the document?
We certainly did after
Or prompted by DCLG, though?
prompted by DCLG, but I don't recall, I cannot recall exactly. But as I say, I've got no problem with the comment. I'm sure I wouldn't have had any problem with it at all at the time. It's just, where do you put that information and I've given my rationale for where I thought it best sat.
But FSG policy was obviously a local policy rather than national guidance, wasn't it?
It was, but we'd shared it nationally. In fact, fire survival guidance wasn't mentioned at all in version 2 of the GRA. So alongside sharing the GRA, we had, certainly at the committee meetings, we'd made it clear that LFB had a policy and that other brigades should consider adopting the policy. And I remember sharing it with quite a few of the committee members that asked to see it.
Thank you. If we can move to the next paragraph in the text, which reads, the IC should normally follow any evacuation plan devised as part of the occupier's fire risk assessment, unless the fire situation dictates otherwise. In residential buildings, occupants should usually only evacuate if the fire, heat, or smoke adversely affect them in their property. So the words inserted there in red text are, to make it consistent, it would appear with the FSG policy. The type of evacuation being undertaken, progress of evacuation, the number and type of people being evacuated can adversely affect firefighting observations. You nodded, which I encourage you to nod, for which apologies. But those insertions, if you can just expressly confirm for the record, brought the text into line with LFB's FSG policy, is that right?
Indeed.
Did you discuss that with Michael Curran, do you remember?
I can't remember in detail because I can't remember whether we discussed any of these points, for sure.
So, in under 10 minutes, I've reached the end of that topic, and this would be a convenient time for a break.
Very well. Well, that seems a good idea, doesn't it, Mr. Cowup? We'll have a break now, please. We'll come back at 20 to 4. And while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. 20 to 4, please.
Thanks, sir.
Would you ask Mr. Cowup to come back in, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Cowup, ready to carry on?
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear, when you're ready.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Cowup, could we now turn to the Lacknell House Coroner's Rule 43 letters that were addressed to the LFB and also CLG as was? Now, shortly after Michael Curran's proposed amendments, the LFB received a copy of the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendations addressed to the Brigade and arising out of the evidence that she heard during the inquests. Did you see that letter when it was received by the LFB?
Yes.
Now, if we can turn to look at it, it's dated the 28th of March 2013 and can be found at LFB 000 32158. And if we can look at the bottom of the first page of the letter and the paragraph which starts with the words, "Before I set out." And the coroner said this: "Before I set out my recommendations, I acknowledge that the London Fire Brigade have already undertaken extensive work to learn from their experience with the fire at Lacknell House, have introduced new policies, and have reviewed existing policies in respect of a number of matters of significance, including..." And then if we turn over the page, the coroner sets out the list of learning points in respect of which she considered that the LFB had already undertaken work. Now, the fourth bullet point reads thus, and I quote, "Awareness that fire can spread downwards and laterally in a building and that burning debris might fall through open windows or onto balconies." And the fifth bullet point says this: "Awareness of the risk of spread of fire above and adjacent to a fire flat." Now, the latter point, fire spread above and adjacent to a fire flat, that appears to be a failure of compartmentation that's referred to there. Was that your reading of that phrase?
Probably. Sounds very bad, doesn't it? I think it probably mainly refers to external spread, but I'm very conscious that in the case of Lacknell, there was also significant internal spread.
And did you read it as dealing with external spread at the time? Do you remember?
I don't know if I necessarily differentiated between the two. I just think I would have understood it probably mainly in the context of external spread because it refers specifically to above. But the adjacent on the same floor would more likely be internal.
Thank you. Now, the coroner goes on to state at the end of this list of bullet points, "I therefore do not make any recommendation in relation to such matters." Are you able to say what work the coroner was referring to as having been carried out by the LFB in the period between the Lacknell fire and the inquests, specifically in relation to those fourth and fifth bullet points, i.e. awareness of the risk of fire spread downwards and laterally, and awareness of the risk of fire spread above and adjacent to the fire flat?
Yes. I mean, substantially, that was covered in the revision of Policy Note 633. So, as you know, and then subsequently brought into GRA 3.2. So, for the first time, we specifically mention the fact that fire can spread downwards, principally through falling debris, and we made very clear that it can spread laterally as well, mainly through failures in compartmentation.
Apologies, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, sorry.
Now, the letter goes on to set out the recommendations of the coroner, and if we could look at those recommendations that concern incident commanders, which appear at the bottom of page 2 onwards. There we go, under the subheading Incident Commanders, it says this: "During the Lacknell House fire, there were 6 changes of incident commander, with some serving as IC for brief periods. It is recommended that the Brigade review its policy and procedures concerning incident command, having regard to whether it is effective for the choice of incident commander to be tied closely to the number of type of appliances attending an incident, and the effectiveness of a policy which," going on to page 3, may result in rapid or frequent changes of IC. It is also recommended that consideration be given to training of ICs and potential ICs to enhance their performance in relation to the following. The third bullet point then read this: to anticipate that a fire might behave in a manner inconsistent with the compartmentation principle. Now, did you give specific consideration when you read this letter to whether your revised 3.2 adequately addressed the need to ensure that incident commanders were able to anticipate that a fire may not behave in a manner consistent with the compartmentation principle?
Yes, and I think 3.2 covers that adequately. It's in there as a hazard under the fire development and behaviour section.
Now, the draft 3.2 that you had prepared had adopted the same text from the 2008 edition about contingency plans for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin. Did that reference to fire spread beyond the compartment of origin in the coroner's letter give you reason to consider whether the matter required greater prominence in the draft 3.2?
It feels in that question like we're conflating fire spread and contingency planning. Perhaps you could rephrase what you're seeking for me to clarify.
Well, it's more straightforward than that. In the draft 3.2 that you'd prepared, you basically lifted the same text from the predecessor edition.
Okay.
About contingency plans for fire spread beyond the compartment of origin. So you kept the same text in your revision. Did the coroner's reference in her Rule 43 letter to the potential for spread beyond the compartment of origin prompt you to consider whether you had given sufficient thought, given sufficient advice in the revised 3.2 to the prospect of spread beyond the compartment of origin?
I felt that 3.2 and the draft that was available at this time did cover that in quite considerable detail, and it had it as a particular hazard, and that if you look at the hazard that relates to fire spread, it particularly spells out the breach of compartments.
And did you, sorry to press you on this, Mr. Cowup, did you read this letter, see what the coroner had said about fire spread beyond the compartment of origin, and then go back to your draft and ask yourself the question, have I addressed this in enough detail?
We certainly read this letter and certainly satisfied ourselves that all the issues raised by the coroner had been addressed, yes.
How did you satisfy yourself? Did you go through a line-by-line review of your draft 3.2? How did you do it?
Well, we did go through the letter and make sure that all the issues raised were covered in the document, yes.
And you specifically looked at the text of your draft 3.2 as part of that exercise, did you? Or did you just go through the letter going, dealt with that, dealt with that, dealt with that?
I believe that I produced a document to show a kind of a matrix document, which I think has been disclosed, that covered this very issue. So I specifically created a document to show that we'd addressed the Lacanal findings in the GRA 3.2.
And for what purpose did you draft that document? Was it for internal audit purposes, or was it for the purposes of assuring the Commissioner, for example, that you had actively considered the coroner's recommendations when drafting 3.2?
Well, both, but primarily to assure the Commissioner that we'd covered all of the issues raised here in the document.
Now, can we look at the Rule 43 letter that was sent by the coroner to...
Sorry, can you just help me with this? The way the coroner's letter is structured, with the bullet points at the end of the paragraph we've just looked at, tend to take one's eye off the beginning of that paragraph, which is to do with something completely different, which is choice of incident commander.
Yes.
Was that addressed as well?
I can't really answer that, sir, because the whole issue of incident command policy sat with somebody else.
Right.
So I believe it was.
Yeah.
I believe changes were made to the thresholds at which people would take over, but I'm not the best person to answer that.
No, all right, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Cowup.
No, thank you, sir. Could we go to look at the letter that the coroner sent to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government? And that was also dated the 28th of March 2013 and can be found at HOM quadruple 00018. Did you see that letter at the time?
Yes.
Now, the letter contains the coroner's recommendations for the review of GRA 3.2, which appear in the second paragraph on the second page. And it sets out there, in that paragraph, this. It is recommended that consideration be given to review of the generic risk assessment 3.2, high-rise firefighting, to provide consolidated national guidance as to the following. And then looking at the second bullet point, awareness that fire can spread downwards and laterally in a building, awareness of the risk of spread of fire above and adjacent to a fire flat, awareness that insecure compartmentation can permit transfer of smoke and fire between a flat or maisonette and common parts of high-rise residential buildings, which has the potential to put at risk the lives of residents or others. Did you go through the exercise of putting the coroner's letter on one side and seeing whether your draft 3.2 satisfied those recommendations?
Yes, in the same way that we did for the letter that was addressed to LFB. And regarding those 4 points, I would contend that GRA 3.2 covers them all.
And for that exercise, did you also prepare a schedule which set out the conclusions of that comparative analysis?
Is that the matrix I think that's the matrix.
Well, I don't know what you're referring to, Mr. Cowup. You have the advantage of me.
I can remember providing a document which specifically addressed the Rule 43 letters and to provide an assurance that the GRA met the requirements of those letters, yes.
And that assurance was addressed just the Commissioner, or was it addressed the Commissioner and the Secretary of State?
I certainly didn't send it to the Secretary of State. I wasn't in the habit of writing to ministers. Derek Clough, I think, had sight of it. But it was probably more likely had a mainly internal audience, to be fair.
Internal to the LFB for the avoidance of doubt.
Yes, within LFB.
Now, on the 4th of April 2013, so just under a week after these letters were sent, you emailed Gary Reason, copying in Jim Knighton, Philip Morton, Danny Cotton and Tim Cutbill, with the subject heading Changes to High-Rise GRA Arising from Lacknell Inquest. And the email can be found at LFB 00008 quadruple 6. Now, if we go to page 2, and in particular the middle of that page, this is the originating email. Dear Gary, further to our earlier conversation, I'm pleased to confirm that the current, open brackets, speech marks, final, closed speech marks, close brackets, draft of the National High-Rise Generic Risk Assessment, GRA 3.2, already provides national guidance on all of the issues which have been identified for review by the coroner in her letter to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government dated 28th of March 2013. One of the advantages arising from the decision that LFB should lead on the review and rewriting of this GRA was that SM, so Station Manager Morton and myself, as document authors, have been able to maintain close liaison with the investigation and inquest teams and thereby identify and anticipate issues arising at an early stage. All these points were therefore brought into the draft at a relatively early stage, alongside learning points from colleagues in other fire and rescue services relating to incidents such as Harrow Court and Shirley Towers. As a result of this close liaison with the Lacknell team, it has become apparent that there are several areas which mainly relate to planning and the risk that fire and smoke can spread more rapidly and unpredictably beyond the compartment of origin in fires and high-rise buildings, where it would be beneficial to, open speech marks, amplify, close speech marks, certain points which already form part of the final version of this GRA. None of these amplifications constitute new issues or considerations, but it clearly makes sense to take this opportunity to ensure that the outcome of the Lacknell inquest is fully reflected in the revised high-rise GRA. I envisage this work being completed within the next 14 days, after which I will provide a revised final draft version document to you for your agreement. After that, the proposal is to produce an abstract of the high-rise GRA, which only includes the amplifications, clarifications made as a result of Lacknell for circulation via Lee Brinton, who is Programme Manager responsible for publication of the revised GRA series, to the GRA Working Group. This group includes representatives from all CFOA regions, staff side, and the HSE. This will enable all relevant stakeholders to see the additional changes which have been made as an outcome of the Lacknell inquest, but at the same time avoid the risk of reopening a full-blown consultation of what is otherwise an agreed document, given the fact that we will only be adding further detailed information to the already agreed text. I anticipate and trust that this final review process can be completed quickly, thus allowing the revised GRA to be published without delay. Now, on one reading, there appears to be a tension in this letter which I'd like to discuss with you. On the one hand, you say in the first paragraph that the current final draft of the GRA already provides national guidance on all issues identified by the coroner. But on the other hand, you go on to say the result of close liaison, certain areas would require certain amplification. Is that a fair description or fair identification of a tension between the 2 points made in that email?
Yes, I would accept that. Clearly, I'm saying, and I'd forgotten about this email, so it kind of contradicts what I said just now.
It does kind of.
And I accept that. So apologies to the inquiry, that was just my memory. So clearly, when we looked at the letters, as you suggested, we would do, we did spot that in certain respects, and I noticed we in particular talk about compartmentation and spread of fire and smoke. We obviously spotted that the GRA needed to be enhanced in those areas. I say enhanced because I think the basic hazard was there, but it wasn't perhaps described as fully as it was appropriate to do so, and that really vindicated the reason to wait for the coroner's inquest findings.
Now, the implication is these, which you say more explicitly there, that the issues were already being addressed in the draft 3.2, and it might take further tweaks, for want of a better phrase, to address the coroner's recommendations. In other words, no further significant work was needed. Is that a fair reading of your attitude at this time of what more was needed?
I think it's fair to say that I didn't see anything in those letters that required a substantial rewrite, but clearly, and this email captures it, I think, fairly well in the body of it, that there were aspects of the description that could be improved, and in particular with the areas that I highlighted in paragraph 3.
When you said that these matters required, quotes, amplification, close quotes, isn't that just an euphemistic underplaying of the fact that the draft offered no practical advice or guidance to incident commanders about what they should be trained to do when faced with unexpected fire behaviour?
No, no, I don't accept that, because I don't accept that the basic draft was flawed in this respect. It just didn't contain the detail and the emphasis on it that clearly came out of the final inquest findings. So it was important to reflect that, but I think the document did cover those issues, and what the changes we made at this point only enhanced that.
Now, could we go back to page 1 of the email chain we're looking at the moment? And it's really the second email on that page, sent on the 5th of April 2013 at 15:44 hours. And it's an email from Lee Brinton to Anthony Maud at CLG. And it says in the second paragraph this: "This makes clear the next steps and provides an idea of timescales for completion. On speaking with Peter yesterday and considering those who would need to have sight of the additions, I would hope publication can be the end of May." Now, presumably the discussion with Peter is a discussion with you.
Yes.
Do you remember any discussion with Lee Brinton at this stage about the nature of the intended changes and how long they take to carry out?
I don't recall them in detail.
Did you discuss with her who would need to see your intended additions?
I think based on her email, I think I must have done, because what I was conscious of, we had a document that we'd finally agreed with the Fire Brigade Union that had taken an awful long time, and I was very conscious that if we made extensive changes, they would be quite rightly unhappy that we hadn't kept, the integrity of the document in terms of the one they had agreed to. However, given what I'd said elsewhere about the additions, and the fact I saw them as enhancements of points that were already there, I think I was probably talking about a smaller group than the full body of national consultation, because that would have introduced yet more delay for no particular benefit in my view.
And who formed part of this small group that you're intending to discuss the new additions with?
Well, certainly the people within LFB that had been directly involved. Lee Brinton, Derek, I'm not sure if Derek Clough may have retired by then, whoever was working with Lee. And I think at this stage, it was also about making sure that CLG were happy with it, because I think by this stage it had gone to them for typesetting and their quality assurance. So clearly they had to be happy with the amendments that were going to be made.
By this stage, if Derek Clough had retired, and I think you're right in assuming he had retired by this stage.
I think he retired in January, but I'm not certain.
How was the voice of CLG being articulated in sort of the first part of the first quarter of 2013? Can you remember?
He was involved in the discussions with the Fire Brigade Union, so he didn't retire immediately in January, because I believe they were in January 13. I think by February we'd sent the final version to the FBU and had not heard back that, in a positive sense, that they were happy with it, but took their silence to mean
Consent.
And if I'm honest, there would have been a lull then until the Rule 43 letters had come out. So there probably wasn't a lot going on. And that's a long-winded way of answering your question. I don't think I had a lot of interaction with CLG during that particular period.
Thank you. Now, I would now like to look at the response from the Secretary of State, who's then Mr. Eric Pickles, and it's dated the 20th of May 2013. It can be found at HOM 000-47743. And if we can go to the part which deals with GRA 3.2, which is on the second page in the third paragraph, it says this: "On your other recommendations, I can confirm that my department's generic risk assessment guidance on high-rise firefighting is under review at present and will be informed by all of the recommendations you have made in your Rule 43 recommendations. It will also include advice to incident commanders to inform decisions on evacuation should it become clear during an incident that the stay put principle is no longer tenable." Did you see that letter before it was sent?
No, not before it was sent.
You saw it afterwards?
I believe I would have seen it sometime afterwards. I can't say for sure when.
Now, can I turn to...
Sorry, could I just see when it was dated?
Of course, it's it's May 2013, so it's 20th of May 2013.
Okay, I have seen it before, and now I'm trying to think, have I seen it as part of my preparation for this inquiry, or did I see it at the time?
Did you see it in draft?
I certainly didn't see it in draft.
Presumably you wouldn't have seen it unless it was forwarded to you by someone at CLG after it was sent.
Correct.
And at the time, who was the most likely contact that you had?
To be fair, I think it would have come to LFB via the Lacanal review team, because I think they still, and possibly via the Commissioner himself, because obviously there were various lines of communication to CLG. So it's quite possible that it came into LFB through that route.
So you can't remember, say, for example, it came via Les Britzman, for example?
I don't recall Les Britzman sharing this with me either as a finished document or as a draft. Certainly not as a draft. But he may have sent it to me, but I can't recall that.
Can I now turn to a separate topic, which is DCLG's involvement in progressing the draft GRA 3.2? Now, at this stage, there was the start of considerable and sustained involvement from officials at the department with draft GRA 3.2. And in your third witness statement, which can be found at LFB 00119849/78, you say at paragraph 171 that, and I quote, "It was during this stage of the review," referring to the period July to November 2013, during which you state that there were various discussions with DCLG, that much of the content relating to the explicit reference to stay put as a named concept and design principle was added to 3.2. Does that remain your evidence?
Yes.
Now, if we can just go through chronologically CLG's involvement and your communications with them about 3.2. Now, we know that CLG had been provided with a copy of the final draft, I use final in inverted commas for these purposes, of GRA 3.2 in or around June 2013. And if we could please look at an email exchange between you and Peter Holland, who by that stage was the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor, on the 19th of June 2013, and which you then forwarded to Gary Reason. We can find that exchange at LFB 00098993. And if we go to page 3, we see there an email from Peter Holland to you, timed 17:25 hours. He says, "Peter, good to meet you today. Thanks very much for the offer to visit the Shard. I'm free on the morning of the 1st of July from 9 until 11:30, so it can be fitted in at that time, please." And if we go to page 2, and it's the bottom email from you to Ron Dobson and Gary Reason, sent on the 19th of June. It's the same day, timed at 19:46 hours, and you state this: "Sirs, please see note below from the Chief Fire Rescue Service Advisor. This request arose from a meeting SM Phil Morton and myself attended earlier today at CLG, Elland House, to finalise the formatting and layout of the high-rise GRA. The CFRA and Anthony Maud attended part of the meeting and showed considerable interest in the GRA and the work we have done to complete it. He asked a number of questions, and I believe I was able to reassure him that we have fully addressed all the recommendations issues arising from the Lacknell and Shirley Towers instance." First of all, do you remember the meeting between you, Philip Morton, Philip Holland, and Anthony Maud on the 19th of June?
I certainly can remember the meeting taking place, but the detail of what we discussed, no.
Now, you refer in that email to reassuring officials that the recommendations and the issues arising from Lacknell had been fully addressed in the draft GRA. Was that reassurance necessary because Mr. Holland and Mr. Maud had doubts about whether they had, in fact, been adequately addressed?
I certainly don't remember them approaching the meeting from that perspective. I think they was interested in what we'd done. We spoke about the consultation process, if I remember. We spoke particularly about the challenges we'd had securing Fire Brigade Union agreement to the document, which, as you know, was through extensive discussion. And then I think we got into, at some point, we did get into this discussion about the shard, and I was keen to show them or talk about the systems at that particular building, which, being very modern and very cutting edge, had developed to provide information for operational crews.
Can you remember how granular the discussion was about GRA 3.2? So, for example, did Mr. Holland or Mr. Maud have a copy of the draft in front of them and saying, Mr. Cowup, you haven't addressed X, Y, or Z?
I can't. I certainly don't remember them raising any concerns. I'm fairly confident about that. Whether they had a copy of the draft in front of them, whether we spoke about any particular aspect of it, I honestly can't recall.
Thank you. So I've come to the end of a particular topic. The next one will, I think, take longer than 15 minutes to address.
Yes.
We are, however, doing well for time. And so I sense it's been a long day for Mr. Cowup. This would be, subject to your approval, a convenient place to end for the day with no harm to completing Mr. Cowup's evidence in time.
Yes, well, I don't suppose Mr. Cowup will complain if we stop a little earlier than usual.
No, sir.
You're getting on quite well, are you?
Yes.
Mr. Cowup's down to give evidence for quite a long time, but anyway, we can afford to rise a little bit early.
I think we can, and Mr. Cowup, has given detailed answers today, for which we're grateful.
Yes, of course. Well, Mr. Cowup, we normally go on a little longer than this, but tonight is convenient to stop at this point. As I say, you probably don't mind anyway.
Thank you, sir.
So we'll stop there for the day. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it over the break.
Understood.
Right? We'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnear. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Yes.